Thank you all for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I am Stephanie Small, Product Coordinator at BookNet. Welcome to Embedding Sustainability, Tips for eBook and Print Production. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote, and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the native-land.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you're joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. If during today's presentation you have questions, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. For today's webinar, we'll have two back-to-back presentations focused on sustainability. Speaking on print production is Jazmin Welch. Jazmin is the owner of Fleck Creative Studio and book designer at Arsenal Pulp Press. She works with a wide range of indie presses, organizations, and authors. She has a love for the smallest of details and revels in the problem-solving challenge that each new book poses. She focuses on creating compelling and page-turning designs that stand out on bookshelves, resonate with readers, and respect each author's unique point of view. Jazz is a book lover at heart who is ready to advocate for your story and impress your readers. She holds an honors bachelor degree of design from Toronto Metropolitan University and a Master of Publishing from Simon Fraser University. As a nature lover, the environment is top of mind in her practice, and she's always looking for new ways to bring sustainability into the world of book design. On digital sustainability is Tzviya Siegman. Tzviya works for W3C as Sustainability Director. She has worked in web and ebook standards for more than 15 years. Tzviya has contributed to many standards, including ARIA, EPUB, WCAG, and the Web Sustainability Guidelines. She strives to demonstrate that standards are a floor, not a ceiling, and products are improved for everyone when we work toward understanding, not just compliance. Tzviya also works on W3C member engagement and the Code of Conduct. In her spare time, Tzviya enjoys her children and pottery. So we're going to start over to you, Jazz.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Jazz, and I'm chatting with you from the traditional territories of the Erie. neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. I work remotely here, designing books for various small presses and independent authors, spending most of my time with the wonderful Arsenal Pulp Press. And a little bit of background as to what led me to this point in my career is that I researched what made for sustainable, satisfying reading experiences in my undergrad in both print and digital formats. And I was exploring the aesthetics and functional things like readability and reader retention. So, diving into the nitty-gritty of how text looks on a page is something that has been dear to me for a long time. And as a nature lover who is very grateful for the nature around me, it's really led me to want to make my work with paper a more sustainable endeavor. So paper is the biggest factor in a book's carbon footprint. So it's important to make sure that sustainability starts with these initial design decisions. Longer books, of course, mean more paper, which means more raw material, heavier books, and larger shipments. So it impacts the entire supply chain. And what we don't often think of is where this really starts, where the paper use starts, which is with design. This makes it clear that shaving down the page count of a single book can have a big economic and environmental impact. And now that there are carbon calculators out there, one of which being the Sustainable Publishing Tools Book Carbon Footprint Calculator, that's actually hosted on the BookNet Canada website. The link will be in the chat. We can now see real data regarding this impact. In production, we can make sustainable packaging and paper choices, but long before that, we can look to book design to assess the overall page count of a book. So there are a vast number of reasons as to why a page counts of a book can start to climb, and they're the fault of no one, but it can happen quite easily. Publishers, anyone in the publishing chain, we all work very heavily and on very fast-paced timelines. So manuscripts can come in that are longer than anticipated, that we don't have time to edit down or push into a new season. So books can get long that way. And sometimes books come in on the shorter side when they are, contract sign and it comes in too short. Sometimes we'll end up beefing up the book to make it longer and kind of slowing down the production process to really ask why these things are happening is important to make sustainable choices. And as you can see, these are all editorial discussions as well. So editorial decisions also have a huge impact when it comes to sustainability. And again, it's very clear that this happens across the whole supply chain, just backing down to paper. It changes how much paper is used in the print process, how heavy things are to ship. And then, of course, with the world of books, things get returned and eventually destroyed. So it has a big impact overall. So once editorial has made their final decisions around the word count of a book, a manuscript is then in the designer or the typesetter's hands. And at this stage, the solution to reducing page count is sustainable book design or sustainable typesetting. So there's some initial conversations that need to happen within a press in order to start working on this endeavor. And of course, it's getting folks on board and being able to slow down and have these conversations. So giving more space for more generous timelines, seeing who on your team is passionate about sustainability. Maybe there's someone like me who loves type and would be really excited about the things that we're about to talk about when it comes to typography, and getting your team really excited about these benefits. You're not just saving the environment, you will actually save money with lighter books across the board. And then also just empowering your designers, whether they're freelance or in-house, to get creative with these decisions, come together, play, research, and explore. And again, we'll kind of go over the ways that we can explore later on in the presentation. And of course, discussing with your team target page counts. So that's something about slowing down the process of production and actually discussing the future of the book and how big it should be before we dive into typesetting. Because I know from personal experience, sometimes we just have no time and we got to typeset what we have and get going. But when we can step back and make some of these decisions earlier on, it will save us in the long run. So when thinking about sustainable book design and typesetting, there are a number of factors that can make a difference. So here's a list of the elements that we as designers can manipulate in a book layout that impacts the paper usage. So of course, the obvious one is the font choice, and that is which font you end up choosing for your body copy. And then within that, there's multiple factors, such as the size of the type. We can't go too small, of course. We can't just shrink the type down to make our books more sustainable because readers don't like type that is on the smaller side, as it makes for a really frustrating read. But certain fonts do better at smaller scales, and we'll talk about why that happens in the next page. And we, of course, also need to consider the audience for the size of type that we're going to go with. X height is another really important factor that we'll go over next, as well as the thickness and the width of the font. Then there's also leading, which is the space between lines, and we have to ensure that it doesn't get too tight or too loose because, again, the book will be too hard to read, but we don't have to go with really wide leading for a beautiful looking book. There's also the margins to factor in. Too small margins will look really compressed and too tight, and also it will impact the length of line in each line of the text. There's kind of a sweet spot that is around 50 to 75 characters for an easy reading experience, because if a reader gets to the end of the line, that's too many characters long. It's really hard for them to circle back and figure out the next starting point of the line. So as margins get smaller and the line length gets longer, we end up with a more troubling reading experience. But again, we don't need to have insanely large margins in order to make a beautiful reading experience. There are also some typesetting conventions that are traditional long-standing rules in the book world, many of which many publishers follow, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are things that we can question to shorten our books as well. Like, do we need, a half title page? Are there a lot of blanks that could be reduced? An epigraph on a different side of the page, as well as things like starting chapters on recto pages and leaving the verso blank. All of those things can have an impact on page count. And lastly, of course, is the signatures in the book itself. So talking with your printer, what is the signature or optimal page count where we will have the least amount of page waste, and then making sure your designer is aware of that so that they can hit that page count without having a lot of extra paper at the end. Because again, if you are able to drop down a signature, whether that's 8, 16, or 32 pages across a whole print run, that will save a lot of paper. And you can't talk about sustainable book design without mentioning 2K Denmark. They're pioneers in this space, and I've seen a couple of their presentations on sustainable typesetting. It's really exciting stuff. You can actually hire them to typeset books for you, or you can access their proprietary fonts for a per book licensing fee, or even have them create a font for you. They put in a lot of research to develop fonts that are maximum efficiency, more compact at small sizes, and they say that they can reduce your book by 20 to 50% for higher profit margins and lower carbon footprints. But today I'm going to be diving into suggestions that in-house teams and freelancers can take into their publishing houses to workshop and actively participate in. The principles we'll discuss in a minute come from the basics of typography research, and that any designer or typesetter can access and use. And as a book designer myself, I'll also note that I'm not interested in sacrificing beautiful and elegant design for sustainability. I believe that we can achieve both. So here are some type options to consider. And as mentioned, X height is a factor in your type choice, and it plays a really important role in legibility. So the X height is the height of the lowercase x in any given font. Fonts with larger X heights and thicker, more sturdy appearances are more suitable to scale down. So the sizes listed here underneath each type specimen are all comparable to each other, meaning that they will take up approximately the same number of pages at these sizes, but two fonts in the same point size can appear vastly different depending on their X height. So this can be a big part of your choice as to what font to run with in your books. Also important to note that a font with a really big X height will also be hard to read, but a font with a really small X height will definitely need to be scaled up larger in order for it to be legible at the same size as a font with a larger X height. And I added in Garamond here as the first specimen because that is widely considered a fairly sustainable font. Not everyone agrees with this, of course, but it does have great ink usage and readability. But because it has kind of thinner elements to it, is less robust than the fonts on the right side, it won't scale down as small. So some other aspects of fonts that we want to consider when we're choosing a great body copy font would be how narrow the font is. You can't just make a font extremely condensed and hope that it'll help make your book more sustainable. It still needs to be, not too narrow, or the reading experience will be not as satisfying. Another important factor is distinguishing between letter forms. So does the font have a clear O versus A, for example, so that when scaled down, the letter forms aren't getting confused. You can also experiment with different thicknesses. More bold fonts will show up better at smaller sizes, but of course, they will also kind of get more muddy together. So you can see how there's a lot of factors at play here. So it does require some experimenting. And it's really important for you to kind of test the sizing and weights of various options, print out paragraphs, compare for legibility and readability. Printing things out is one of the most important things you can do to see how things really feel on the page. Another thing to be wary of is, of course, contrast. So the thick and thin aspects of the font. Is there a really high difference between the two? Because that will be hard to see at a smaller scale as well. And lastly, something to factor into your decision is the personality of the type. For example, do you want the type to be friendly, traditional, sharp, an old style font? Should it feel like a storybook or relate to a specific historic period that is the book set in? So part of the fun of this work is exploring different font options. But on the flip side, another approach that is totally viable is to choose one font that you would use within your publishing house across the board. Once you've done your research and have found the most compact font that you would like to use that feels like the best sustainable choice, you can keep using it over and over again. So perhaps this sounds like a lot of work for already overburdened teams, but running tests like this only takes a few hours to see some pretty quick results. So I also want to note that these are not strict rules, but suggestions for teams to explore and expand upon. The goal is to be, as I mentioned, more sustainable, but without sacrificing readability or design. Pages can still be clean, balanced, well-designed, while also being more economical. So I did an experiment as part of this, my research in design, because I really wanted to kind of put these factors to the test. So I ran some tests on a full book, but you could just as easily run tests on one page to see how much you can increase your per page word count, which would then decrease your final page count. So when testing on a full book, be sure to have your master pages set in InDesign so that changing the margins or the text block will be able to apply to your full layout. But otherwise, here's how I did my test. The manuscript that I chose was a pretty standard text-only book that was about 86,000 words. And I ran with a 6:9 trim. And then some design details to note is that part names and part section openers were set on their own pages. Chapter opening text started partway down the page. And then there were also dingbat editorial breaks, which means that there were about 3 lines of space between various editorial breaks, which could have also been reduced to reduce the page count. So in the original typesetting, we landed at 310 pages. And to note this original test, we had a font, Jensen was used, which was 11.5 points over 16 points of leading. Then the margins are noted as well. I chose Jensen for this book because it related to the historical period and it felt like it was the right fit. It's also an old style font that is very readable, so it provides a lovely reading experience. On my first test, I just decided to reduce the leading because I am quite a fan of 16-point leading, but it is quite spacious. So my first test was to bring it down to 14. Bringing it down to 15 would have also made a big impact, and I want to kind of hit home the idea here that you can take any note from this presentation and it will have an impact on page count. So you don't have to apply all these things at once, but work on running your own tests and see what you like best for your books. The next test that I ran was to reduce the margins because they were quite roomy. So I reduced the margins slightly on all sides, which also gave me 1 full extra line at the bottom of each page. So that brought us down again to 260 pages. And then in my fourth test, I also removed the blank versos. So now chapters started on both rectos and versos, removing additional amount of pages. So we were at 252. So we got an another signature removed there, which is great. So you see in the test that I did up until this point, I didn't actually change the font size or make it any smaller because I personally felt that Jensen couldn't really go much smaller while retaining its legibility. So in typeset 5 and 6, I tried some of the other fonts from the page I showed earlier that are more legible at smaller scales. So I did source serif at 9 points and Faustina at 9.5 points with the 14-point leading. And they are more compact and more readable. The page count dropped to 238. I would also note that we're kind of getting on the smallest side that I would like to go from a book design perspective because that line length, as mentioned, is getting a little bit too long. But these are still quite readable pages. The personality of the font doesn't match the book, in my opinion, so I would want to keep working on that. But again, you can see that this process is all about experimentation, and I was so pleased to see how many pages we could actually reduce while still having quite a beautiful page layout. So from the results page, you can see that we could save up to 72 pages per book by tweaking our design choices. Across a print run of just 3,000 copies, that would be 216,000 pages, which is a shocking amount of paper. And again, you could take any one of these little changes and still have quite a reduction in your page count. So the aim again is to not sacrifice readability or design for the sake of sustainability, because at the end of the day, if a book is hard to read or extremely unattractive, it's less likely to be read, and a book that isn't read is ultimately not a sustainable option either. So just a few tips that we've discussed, but to bring them home again, as well as a few new tips. The folio and running header placement can also have an impact. You'll often see in the layout, especially that I just showed, you'll have the book title at the top and folio at the bottom. If those were run together, both at the top or both at the bottom, then you could potentially save another couple lines or add a couple lines of text to the page. As noted, if you're playing with your margin size, be sure to check the number of characters per line for readability. And always test print things out. That will make a huge be a huge benefit to you to really see how things will read. And of course, looking at the leading as well. And a few other considerations. This might be more technical terms for your design teams, but I did test some grep and justification adjustments, which did not have much of an impact on the page count, but they do, of course, improve the reading experience. So keep doing that, but it isn't going to really help with sustainability a whole lot. Another thing that can be adjusted from the design side is the keep options. Some publishers have house rules where you can't go, lines need to stay together at the top and bottom of a paragraph. So sometimes you'll see like the baseline of a page will be higher up on some books, on some pages, because the paragraph has been pushed to the next page. Other publishers don't have that as a house rule, so you'll see a single line at the bottom of a page. That could also reduce a little bit of the page count as well. And of course, across a larger book, like the longer the book is, the more impact these changes will have. But things like reducing runs, orphan widows can save a few pages as well, which of course, as we're typesetting, are things that we're already looking out for, but they're important parts of this process. Another thing that can impact page count that we haven't discussed yet is just the amount of space around chapter openings. Of course, we want those to be beautiful introductions to the chapter that are well designed. But if you don't need to have a lot of white space and the book is quite long or has a large volume of chapters, then it is great to kind of discuss that design for those pages to see if we can reduce some white space. And lastly, just some questions for you to ask production and design from this presentation. So for example, can we start chapters on both recto and verso pages? Do we need things like half title page? If there's an advanced praise page, could we move it to the half title page and remove that instead? Again, chatting with your printer to make sure that you're reaching the most economical page count. If you're a couple pages over, talk with your team. Can we bring those pages back so that we can really save on that extra signature and the blank page waste? And of course, can we reduce things like the margins, letting text size a little bit without the design looking too condensed? Because I have noticed a bit of a trend these days with books towards a bit larger type, larger margins, and there's so much white space that some of these 400 to 500 page books almost actually feel like an insult when they could have been half the size and could have actually been more affordable to the consumer. And the white space would have been a production choice. So I think, again, stepping back and really asking why with your publishing team, and slowing down these decisions so that we can make great design decisions, but also decisions that are great for the environment as well. And as mentioned, there are just so many small decisions that we can make that have a big impact. So if you can take even just one tidbit from this presentation and apply it to your books, then you can reduce a substantial amount of paper across an entire print run, because truly every page does actually matter. So thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Tzviya Siegman. I work for the W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium. Give me 1 minute to get my slides up. I worked in publishing for more than 20 years, so some of you might know me. I now am the Sustainability Director at W3C. And today I'm going to talk about the topic of embedding sustainability tips for ebook and print production. I'm doing the ebook side. I'm going to give a little bit of a background to digital sustainability, if my slides will advance. Here we go. So let's talk a little bit about web sustainability. I'll talk about the context of why we've written a document called the Web Sustainability Guidelines. I'll offer a little bit of an overview and talk about how this translates to ebooks. In the web sustainability, I hope you're having an easier time doing this in ASL than I am verbalizing this. In the Web Sustainability Guidelines, we approach this from the mindset of sustainability encompassing the three pillars of environmental, social, and governance. The environment addresses the internet and the web's environmental impact, the physical impact. The social impact is the effort to improve the social impact of everything we've done. For example, it's not hard to think about like the physical impact, but social impact, you may have read recently about the impact that the server farms have had in Virginia and how people have turned on their water and the water taps have only had a drip of water. That is a great example of the social impact that a physical presence of the digital world has had on people's lives, and that the governance has to do with responsible practices. So how do we oversee those data farms, and how do we oversee rules about AI and on and on and on. So our starting goals are making it easy to apply sustainability principles and the services that they create, and how do we create metrics around it. We've also tried to align with existing efforts in various governments, including especially in Europe, where there's a lot more sustainability legislation and regulatory interests, including economic reporting and things like GRI. We have several sections. This is divided into 4 sections. So I'm going to go through an example of each section. So in the business and product strategy section, we have guidelines that are aimed at the organizational leadership of an organization, of the business. My words are just not working today. Some examples of things in the business and product strategy. Forgive me, I have a little bit of a migraine and I apologize for the way my words are not coming out today. So we talk about estimating the environmental impact of a product, and we talk about the end of life of a product and how you can plan for that. So some specific examples are, we talk about mandatory disclosures and reporting. California has mandatory reporting, and there's a lot of requirements for this in Europe as well. So the way that this is structured is we have a specific guideline, and then we have a list of success criteria. This is loosely modeled on WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So we have the requirement to create policies to enable people to document the mandatory disclosures and reporting. And this affects the one of the success criteria is that this actually impacts the reduction of your environmental waste. The next section is web development, which is perhaps the most intuitive section to include in web sustainability guidelines. These are guidelines for the programmers, for the engineers, and this will reduce your data payloads and lower emissions. So we have goals for performance and energy impact, we avoid redundancy in code, and we have metadata for machine readability. So a very simple guideline is removing unnecessary code. And this is really just about, reducing redundancy in information. We don't want to have excess code because that it requires parsing through unnecessary code. It duplicates energy. It requires unnecessary energy. The next section that we have is hosting and infrastructure. This is really a robust section that says a lot in very few words. I don't know why the success criteria didn't, what is happening here with my slides? There it is. Okay. So we have a very a very simple statement: choose a sustainable service provider, which is saying that, for example, the hosting provider that you choose for your data should run, let's say, on solar energy. Does that exist? Not right now, but there are best practices for things, and it's possible to do things like carbon shifting for your hosting, and you can do research about the way that this is accomplished. We also want to optimize caching with offline access. I'll go into this a little bit more when I talk about the way that this is relevant to ebooks. My slides have a mind of their own today. And we talk about data storage strategies as well. And there, okay. So we say okay. The next section is UX design. We have an extensive section about UX because there's a lot about UX that is relevant to sustainability. We want to understand how non-users, meaning non-humans, are impacted by the UX. So how machines parse the files. We want to avoid being manipulative or deceptive because manipulative patterns take a lot of time. And this actually is in, there's some legislation about attention seeking in the EU. There's some legislation about avoiding attention seeking behaviors. And we want to evaluate the use and the value and impact of our ebooks and our websites. So an example of UX is optimizing images for sustainability. Which is something that is going to sound very familiar because it's very similar to optimizing images for accessibility. So we want to assess whether we actually have a need for images because images are very energy, they can use a lot of energy, and we want to make sure that all of the images are optimized. We want to make sure that the smallest images and most they're using energy in the most efficient way possible. And we want to make use of lazy loading because that also means that people are not actually loading the images unless they're absolutely necessary. And we want to make sure that they're sized appropriately and they're deactivated when necessary. So we also have guidelines for image management and use. So you're probably wondering, what can you do about this as an ebook developer? And the good news is you're probably already doing a lot more of this than you think. Many of the web sustainability guidelines match the WCAG success criteria, and I'll give several examples. So 311, you don't need to remember the numbers, I just linked here in case you want to look it up later. Structure metadata for machine readability corresponds with WCAG 1.31. Info and relationships. If you're working on accessibility, you're probably intimately familiar with info and relationships, where it's really important to have things set up in a machine readable way. So when we talked about structuring metadata for machine readability, we're saying that a machine has to be able to parse your files. If machines can't parse your files, they're not really useful, except for somebody who is not disabled in any way. And if you're having a machine trip over it, you're making the machine do extra work and you're wasting energy. So we have some required elements, which will look familiar to anybody who's using HTML. We have the title element, we have meta tags, we have structured data, And those are the only examples I gave. But again, if you've been working in EPUB for more than a few minutes, you are familiar with these, and hopefully you're already doing them. And if you're not, then your EPUBs have some problems. I hope I'm not insulting anybody. So we also have additional alignment with accessibility and security. You want to ensure that your animation is proportionate and easy to control. Easy to control can also mean that it doesn't start without the users turning it on. You want to make sure that you can stop it, that the user has control over when to stop it. Proportionate can mean that there's not too much of the book taken over by animation, and that it's totally in the user's hands. You want to ensure that your code is secure. That's a pretty broad statement, but you want to make sure that you don't have any security leaks. This has been an issue that EPUB's encountered over the years. We probably don't have any security issues that are going to be allowed in an EPUB, or at least not that any reading system will allow to enter a published EPUB. You want to set up necessary error pages and redirection links. Redirection is important. It doesn't always work as well in EPUB as it does on the web, but you want to make sure that we have this set up in such a way that it's easy to read for a user, any user, users with disabilities. It's easy to read for a machine, and that it's set up in a secure way as well. So let's talk also about how to take the next steps. It's similar to accessibility and privacy. It's about your products and your tooling. You want to, we have the requirement to assign a sustainability advocate. That sounds an awful lot like assigning an accessibility manager, which is in WCAG. We want to support mandatory disclosure and reporting. Just like with accessibility, we want to set up a system in our organizations so that we can have the scaffolding to do the audits. We call them in accessibility, but we want to do the reporting. In some states in the United States, and I believe in some parts of Canada, definitely in the EU, the disclosures and reporting are the most important. What are the disclosures and reporting? Often it's just about emissions. We want to not be behind the curve on what it is that we're disclosing and reporting, and we want to know how it is that we can do the disclosure and reporting. You're going to ask me what it is that you're disclosing and reporting on. I'll get to that in a minute. And probably, as I mentioned before, the most important is to choose a sustainable service provider. What are the services? Perhaps it's who is hosting your cloud data. Perhaps it's who your internet service provider is. You're going to have to do a little bit of research about what sustainable means. Is this even possible in your area? But it might not be something that's in your hands, but it is possible in some areas. So there are some guidelines that are extremely relevant to ebooks. We want to reduce the impact of downloadable and physical documents. So if you can reduce the size of your ebooks, that could be incredibly meaningful, right? Ebooks are obviously downloadable. We don't generally download physical documents with ebooks. We could be looking at print CSS, however. We want to, sorry. It is with the print CSS, we want to use sustainably beneficial user preference media queries. There have been people in the past who have created print CSS alongside their ebooks. This might be a bit of a controversial topic. It's something I certainly tried to do in my past in ebooks. It's not necessarily a popular approach to ebooks, but it is possible. It's something I really would love to catch on, but I don't think it's going to. You want to optimize caching with offline access supporting, with offline access supported. So you want to make sure that the way that your caching works has, this is a very big issue in EPUB, that the offline access is available. So EPUB is generally available offline. You want to make sure that people are not constantly online, that the way that EPUB is accessible is an offline version of EPUB. So always online is incredibly energy consumptive, and you want to make sure that that offline access is a supported way to get to the EPUBs. And you want to make sure to communicate the environmental impact of user choices from a user perspective. So, if you're already creating ebooks that are having a positive environmental impact, then that is a great thing for your business and communications and marketing departments to be telling the world. When we first started creating ebooks, the world was very excited about the fact that this did not have that this was a more sustainable solution, but we didn't exactly market it as such. Now we are, 30 years after the internet was is popularized, we recognize the negative impacts of the internet, but ebooks compared to print books, it's hard to know which one has a more negative impact on the environment, but there definitely are sustainable ways to create ebooks, and we can certainly talk about the benefits. Let's talk about how it is that we measure. In the guidelines that we've created, we're working on a metrics tool right now, a metrics API that will go through each of the guidelines, and that's not available yet. This guideline is still a work in progress. It should be available the next few months. But you can take a look at any of these tools and try to understand how your websites, what the impact of your websites are, and how you can take a look at them and reduce emissions and improve performance. Now, just like a lot of other tools that are made for the web, we might need to talk about how to adapt these to EPUB. But if you take a look at EcoGrader, CO2.js, or the Web Sustainability Index, you can plug in a URL and you can get a rating for your website. So if you do techforum.net, I think it is, and plug it into EcoGrader, you could get a score. There's a lot of controversy about exactly how these measurements are done, but the general consensus is that having some measurement is better than having no measurement. The controversy tends to come around exactly how to measure CO2e or carbon equivalence. So the world is still coming to terms with what these words mean, and as I said, having some measurement is better than none. Carbon.txt is a machine-readable text file that you could embed in your EPUB to explain what sustainability data, it's a sustainability metadata file, and that could easily be added to EPUB. I don't even know that we'd need to tweak anything in the EPUB specifications to add it. It's a robots text file along the lines of many of the other text files that have already been added to EPUB. So if you're already interested in including this information in your EPUBs as a way of disclosing information, reporting and disclosing information about individual books, there's already a way to do this. And my main message about this, and it's very much like what we used to do with accessibility, is sneak it in when you can and get support to move it forward. So we have kind of the grassroots effort combined with trying to get support from your leadership. Accessibility now has broad support largely because of the EU legislation and Ontario legislation and possibly US legislation, but we aren't there yet with sustainability. There's often a lot more support from individuals than you will have from people who need to support it financially. But people are really interested in this, and there's real reason to support this. Like, the planet is burning, and we really need to do whatever we can. And as Jazz said, do whatever you can, and feel free to reach out to me. I forgot to include my email address in this last slide, but feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about how to move this forward.
All right. Thank you both for all of that fascinating information. We've got some time. We're going to take some questions from the chat. And I think I'll start off with one for both of you. You both mentioned how important it is to get buy-in from others on your team to support these sustainability initiatives. Do you have any tips for publishing professionals who are maybe not decision makers to get their organizations and peers to adopt sustainable practices? Shall we start with Jazmin?
Sure. I think it definitely is a tricky topic because, like I mentioned, that teams, especially of small presses, everybody's quite overburdened already. So the production department as well as publisher and editorial. So I think from my side of things in production, I think one of the best ways that you can sneak these things into conversation is that it actually will be a cost savings. Like, there's a lot of sustainable choices that come down to financial savings as well. So even if you can't get on board with using, uncoated paper stock and things like that that might not have the cost benefit, because some sustainable choices when it comes to printing are more expensive. But when it comes to design, these are things that you're doing anyway. It won't change your typesetting costs, but reducing the page count of a book will save dollars when it comes to printing as well as shipping and all of that. That would be my suggestion, is approaching it from the financial angle a little bit to see if you can get some buy-in. And maybe even if you are a typesetter and designer like myself, if you need a little bit more time to assess these things, maybe asking your publisher or whomever you report into, if you can get a little bit more time on the next book that you're typesetting, to be able to explore these things. So I know it's tricky with timelines being so fast, but to be able to carve out even just 2 hours to make the type choices for your book, that can be that can have a big impact, and then you can present the changes to the publisher as well.
Right. Money talks. Tzviya, would you say it's the same on the digital side?
Um, Sort of. I think that's absolutely a great tactic. I think that on the digital side, it's a great idea to show managers, executives that there are already things that are being accomplished. Like if you're doing things in an accessible way, often you're already halfway there. So let's finish the job. Obviously, you can't quite finish it, but start small. And it also, I'm always a fan of the carrot and stick approach. Here's this legislation that's emerging out of the EU. What are we going to do next year when XYZ happens? And so, with websites, you can't say my website is only available in New York. If your website's available in France, the people who are using RCEP in France are going to have answers. So we'll need to be compliant with the European legislation, which is much stricter.
Right. And hey, legislation might have that financial impact as well. So it's a very good point to make. Okay. So maybe we've talked about how you're kind of making the case for your higher ups in your organization. But maybe we should think about how you have conversations with your clients. Maybe they have default formats or, kind of ready to go designs that they always go to. How do you have conversations with them about making changes for sustainability? Are there certain approaches that you find work best for customers, for clients? Jazmin, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. I think it could be kind of a similar conversation as well, because I work with self-published authors as often as well, and they are printing their own books or they're uploading to various POD services, so they will see that a smaller book also costs them less money. But I think from a book design perspective, kind of showing folks that these changes don't mean a less elegant, sophisticated design necessarily. I think there is some finessing to get these things right. And I think anyone who starts playing with these ideas will perhaps feel some of the changes are quite jarring. They don't want to go too far with some of them. And like I mentioned partway through my presentation, I love a 16-point letting, but I know publishers that use 14 because it's takes up a lot less space. So sometimes it's just getting around preferences as well. I think publishing is one of those industries that has such long-standing traditional rules about things. So just kind of getting things up to date and being okay to break rules and change things to not have all those tons of blanks in a book and stuff like that. And I think just, from a designer, just sharing the work that you do and what it looks like and presenting beautiful work will also get people on board with these sustainable choices.
We do love a good visual, that's for sure. Tzviya, would you say that the digital space as well has kind of a more templated approach, or are they more open to experimentation and design of ebooks in order to get these more sustainable
Uh,
formats?
I think ebooks, it very much depends on what kind of ebook you're designing. If you're designing a children's book or a cookbook, people have very particular visions. When you're talking about your corporate website, people might be it might be appealing to talk about the performance, which I did not mention in the slide, but that's another area where if you're improving your web performance, in all likelihood, you're improving your sustainability, and that's something that will really appeal to your product team. But when you use words like that, that's going to talk about, you're talking about your bottom line. But if like Jazz was saying, when you're talking about something that has a really important visual, it's about breaking norms. And I've had enough experience with cookbook authors to know that that's going to be a real challenge in that area. But when you're talking about, a basic text-only ebook, especially if it's templated, I feel like there's a lot more room for flexibility.
That's a very good point that it kind of changes based on the type of book that you're looking at. Okay, here's a question. Maybe this is a little bit more for Jazz, but you mentioned a lot during your presentation about legibility or readability. How do you know that the what you're designing is legible or readable? Is it experience, or are there tools that you use to kind of give you that insight?
Yeah, there's I guess when it comes to the world of color books, there are a lot of great online resources like contrast checkers for typography, and this would apply to web rules as well. You can type it literally into Google like contrast checker, and you can have your foreground and background color, and it'll tell you, at what scale the type is still readable. To my knowledge, there's not a direct tool that will tell you at what point the font is too small to be readable because everybody's eyes are quite different. Um, but there is a practice. It does come a lot from just ongoing research and making a ton of books over the course of my career. But in my undergrad as well as in my master's, we did this practice called the readable paragraph, where you are, typesetting just a block of text and, playing with the line length, the type size, the type choice, and the leading, all the things that we talked about to really get the most readable paragraph that's satisfying. You're not exhausted reading it. You can find the start of the line really well. It's got that right contrast between thick and thin. It's not too high of a contrast. So it is kind of one of those things that you learn over time to really assess, which is why I think a lot of what I wanted to get across is about experimentation. Because if open up your InDesign file and you've got 5 different paragraphs typeset in different ways. That's why printing it out is so critical because you'll start to develop your own rules and your own kind of ability to see what is most readable. Because there are certain fonts that you'll see immediately just feel like, oh, I've never seen a book that was typeset in a font like this. There's something off here. There'd be a reason why that font wasn't used. So there's not like the rules are there to follow, but I think a lot of it is just exposure to really good typesetting. So I also, when I'm mentoring younger designers, I'll say maybe they should get like a leading ruler and point size ruler because when you're reading a book that you love the feel of, you can actually just go and check what this type size was. There might even be a call font at the back where you can check the font as well, and you'll start kind of building up your roster that way of preferred designs. But to your point about templates as well, I think doing a template for your publishing house, if you are a designer that works with a publishing house that uses templates, you can definitely work towards creating a new template and keeping it as a templated approach, but just nudging the fonts and the sizing in a different direction to kind of make some sustainable choices.
And this is why designers are worth their weight in gold. All that experience. So I guess I've always kind of thought of ebooks as a little bit of a different animal because users do typically have more control over things like font size and leading and things like that. Tzviya, are there any aspects of the digital production that you would have to, use your gut, you think, or designers of ebooks would have to use their gut in order to know what the best kind of approach would be? Or are there tools that can be used to increase ebook legibility?
I am not the best person to ask about this, but I do know who I suspect Jazz knows something about this, and I know plenty of ebook designers. I don't think it's professional to recommend individuals here, but I know a lot of them.
You don't have to name drop, that's okay. So, I mean, would the recommendations be pretty similar then, do you think?
I think so, except that, as you know, as everybody here probably knows, with ebooks, you can, like you just said, the user can adjust the font size, the background color, the foreground color, and that's one of the great things about ebooks, and what makes them so usable and accessible.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let's make it a good one. How about for both of you, how do you envision sustainability with respect to book production sort of evolving in the next 5 years? Like, where are we going next? Do we want to start with Tzviya this time?
Sure. I am optimistic that the world of digital sustainability, which includes ebooks, of course, will take off. I think a lot of younger people in particular, but also older people, and I'm not defining what I mean by young and old, um, care a lot about this as individuals, but also from a corporate perspective. And we're seeing some of the problems from an institutional level of what happens when we don't care about this. And I think that organizations really do want to make a difference. And as we see legislation emerge, people will be forced to pay attention to this more and more. So we're seeing guidance come out from around the world about how to pay attention to things digitally. AI is having a profound effect on sustainability. So a lot of what's coming out now is specifically about AI, but there's a lot of peripheral information about what you as an individual can do, what you as an organization can do. And so I'm optimistic that people will start paying attention to things like the size of their files, the footprint of their websites, carbon shifting of their websites, and so on. And so I'm optimistic that that will change and that people will start paying attention to things like little things like lazy loading when they haven't in the past.
Great. And that concept of lazy loading is very interesting to me. We'll have to come back to that another time. Jazmin, do you want to weigh in on your like 5 year evolution thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of feel the same as Via. It's like I think there's just more and more awareness about it, and I do think AI is kind of driving that because there's a lot of information coming out now about how toxic and how bad for the environment our usage of the internet is. But from a print design perspective, I think also there's a lot of room to showcase what publishers are doing from a sustainability initiative. I think, as I mentioned, so many small presses and large presses alike, we're just very behind on things, overburdened teams, very busy. So how we market and showcase what we're doing can actually be quite difficult to get caught up on, even if we're doing accessible ebooks and sustainable packaging, shipping, paper, all that stuff. I think that there's a lot of room to grow and really educate our readers on what we're doing about these things. Because I think readers care. They're, book people are paper people and they want to know where the paper came from, especially with the EU deforestation regulations coming in. There's so much that we have to be worrying about when it comes to paper. So I do think we're moving in a positive direction. As noted with some of the other visual things, there's like kind of long-standing preferences that I think would need shaking up as well. Like when it comes to an uncoated cover stock, for example, are readers comfortable with covers that will fray over time versus like a fully laminated cover that is not recyclable. But I do think if we educate consumers, they do want these choices, but we're not really showcasing that they have these choices and that we're making these decisions. So yeah, I'm optimistic as well. I think people want to know where things are made and how they're made.
Lots of room to grow, it seems like, in this space. Well, thank you both so much, Jazz, Tzviya, for joining us today. Um, Before we go, we'd love it if everyone here could just provide feedback on the session. We've dropped a link to the survey in the chat, so take a couple of minutes to fill that out. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it's available. To all our attendees, we invite you to join our upcoming session, The Partnership Effect libraries and publishers on collaborating and thriving. That's scheduled for November 6th. You can find information about all upcoming events and recordings of previous sessions on our website, bnctechforum.ca. And lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thanks to you all for attending. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.